Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by two of our favourite guests. On this side of me we have Alison Thewliss MP, the MP for Glasgow Central and the SNP's Shadow Chancellor. And on this side we have Ken McDonald, the publisher of iScot magazine. So Ken, how are you this morning?
Good morning, I'm fine.
And Alison, how are you?
Good morning, I'm great, thank you.
Excellent. Well, we start today with our coronavirus statistics update. So this is as of 2 p.m. yesterday. Today's numbers obviously won't be published until a couple of hours from now. But as of 2 p.m. yesterday, a total of 71,092 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 57,787 were negative and 13,305 tests were positive. 1,847 patients who tested positive have sadly died. And last night, 93 patients were in intensive care, with 76 of those having tested positive. And there are now a total of 1,165 people in Scottish hospitals with either confirmed or suspected COVID-19. Again, those numbers in hospital, the numbers of new cases and the numbers of deaths all falling. But of course, sadly, every death is a real tragedy, and we're still quite a long way from kind of getting rid of the virus altogether. If you want to join us in the conversation today, then please do. You can follow us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, and you can join us using the hashtag FullScottish. We'd love to hear from you, and we will flash some of those tweets up on the screen during the show. But we start, first of all, with the big news today is that we're expecting Boris Johnson this evening to announce some sort of change to UK government, or strictly speaking, policy for England with regard to the lockdown. We've seen all over social media and in the papers today this new graphic telling us to stay alert and to control the virus. But that's all been, that's a big change from stay home and protect the NHS. Alison, coming to you first, I wonder, what do you make of this change in tone, at least, from the UK government?
Well, first of all, I think it makes things really, really unclear. Stay at home is a really clear, simple message. Everybody can follow that. Everybody knows what that means. Stay alert against a virus that you can't see just seems absolutely crazy. There's no clarity for that. And we've already seen people, pictures of people sort of going out and reaching lockdown in various different ways. So if people think, oh, well, it doesn't really matter, I don't need to stay at home anymore because that's not what the government are saying, then that just loses the sense of the whole kind of message in the first place.
Yeah, and of course the actual law hasn't changed at all. So why do you think the UK government has decided to change direction at this point?
It's difficult really to understand what they're doing at all here, because there are still hundreds of people, as your figures just said, falling ill and dying of this virus every single day. And to relax that messaging now, when perhaps we don't know, perhaps we're over the peak, but we're certainly not through the worst of all of this, is just irresponsible. I can't understand why they would change the messaging now. And
Ken, this is something that the media were briefed about for Thursday's papers. We saw in a lot of the papers on Thursday, kind of looking forward to a happy Monday and the end of lockdown and all this kind of thing. Why do you think the papers were briefed on Thursday to get this message out, a hint about this message change out early, when, for example, the devolved governments weren't consulted about it?
Well, I mean, essentially, the 90% of the print media in the UK is controlled by 5 individuals, and they are pretty much the PR voice for the government. So essentially, Boris Johnson, I feel, is in a damage limitation exercise that he has no control over what's going on. He's trying to show some essence of control when, in fact, all we're getting is this wartime rhetoric about battling and blitzes and trying to generate the rhetoric of the blitz. And I have absolutely no idea of what in heaven's name that message was supposed to be. I mean, it might as well be stay calm and carry on for all the difference it makes. It's just absolute nonsense. And this is him just trying to be reactive to public opinion and try to show some idea of leadership as opposed to just talking garbage most of the time.
Mm-hmm. And this graphic that we've seen, as we said, the language has changed to this stay alert and control the virus, but it's also changed in colour. It's changed from a red flashes to green flashes, which, subconsciously that's going to tell people to go, that things are okay. Green is, green for go, red for stop. That's pretty much universal. Is this the kind of thing, Alison, that comes from the so-called nudge unit, this idea of kind of subliminal messaging?
It may well, and certainly that red to green switch isn't going to help with the messaging if you're only catching sight of it on a podium or on an advert or something like that. If you're not really paying so much attention, you'll certainly see the green. And most people will see the green rather than the red and think, as you're saying, subconsciously that something has changed. And I don't know whether the nudge unit have sanctioned this or anything else, but it just seems to muddy the waters incredibly much, and it makes it very, very difficult for people really to understand what they're supposed to be doing with that information. How do you stay alert? How do you go about things in that way? And it really does concern me that it is all about these kind of the small group of people that are making these messages, rather than thinking of how the message is actually going to be responded to by the public and what the public are expected to do with the information once they have it.
Yeah.
The government's in full propaganda mode. I mean, only the other day they announced that the EU, Italy, has got the highest deaths in the EU. So they're being very convenient with the truth here, trying to create a narrative that everything's okay. The very first broadcast that Boris Johnson did to the public, I recall him saying outright, Britain is leading the way against the fight in this coronavirus. And it's just words that comes out his mouth, and nobody from the media are pulling him up in it because they have a vested interest in keeping these guys happy. And any time any newspaper does step out of line, you'll find that some individual from government will tell it's about time we decided to let the BBC fund themselves. A clear shot across the bow to get back into line. And you cannot believe anything that comes out of this Westminster government's mouth. I honestly do not believe anything that they say. And you just have to question everything that you hear.
So we heard from Nicola Sturgeon, as I said, when this went into the papers on Thursday. We heard her saying, this was the first she'd heard about it, that she wasn't sure when she was even going to speak to Boris Johnson next. And now this morning she tweeted that this change she was reading about it for the first time in the Sunday papers. What does it say about the way this UK government works, Alison, that they're not communicating properly with the devolved administrations when they're supposedly promoting this four nations approach and demanding that we all go in lockstep?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit rich to demand a four-nation approach and then not consult the other nations or even let them know what your thinking is or what your plans are going to be. And Mark Drakeford and Arlene Foster have been on television this morning saying much the same thing. They're going to stay with the stay-at-home messages in Wales and in Northern Ireland. And further to that, there's been tweets suggesting that even the UK government's cabinet didn't know that this change was coming and that they were furious. That's been tweeted by journalists as well. So it really doesn't give anybody much faith that the four-nation approach is being respected or that it even really exists.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, kind of the same question to you. What do you make of this kind of change, it's not really a change, the way that the devolved administrations are being told they have to move in lockstep with England, but of course public health is a devolved matter, and the devolved administrations are absolutely responsible for their own countries. How is the UK government expecting anyone to actually move in lockstep if they don't know what's going on?
Well, there is no four nations, equal nations here. It's England leading the pack, and we regularly have to pledge allegiance to the UK, and we cannot show up. We cannot have any stats better than's happening down south. because it does show up and embarrass the government of the day. Again, as I reiterate, this is a damage limitation exercise by Boris Johnson, who has been woefully incompetent in trying to manage what is the worst pandemic in Europe. And with death rates so high, he's coming up with this jingoistic notion that we'll all swallow it. And then we have people making up paper aeroplanes, walking in street parties. It's just absolute nonsense. But he's riding the crest of a popularity wave down south. Everybody else can see him for what he is.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer, there's no Four Nations collaboration. It's we do what we're told. We can say what we like, but we have to do what we're told, and that's what's called democracy in this country.
Mm-hmm. David Gethings, the Welsh health minister, the other day said that he was concerned that Wales might have to follow what England decided because there's a lack of independent Welsh media through which the Welsh government could potentially get a different message out. Do you see the same kind of problem happening here, Ken?
It already is. We have no mainstream media here that is not biased towards the union. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't exist. And as you know, and Indie Live and iScot and all these other bloggers that are trying to get the message out, it's still dominated by unionist-owned media outlets that have best in their shares. So it doesn't exist. There is no mainstream media in Scotland that supports independence.
Yeah. Alison, similar kind of point to you, the lack of media that we have up here, the lack of kind of distinctly Scottish media that we have is a problem, and we've talked about that on the show at length in the past. But do you see that as a problem when it comes to how that message gets out, how the differentiated message between Scotland and England gets out there?
I think it does. I mean, when you've got your kind of rolling news channels, your BBC and your Sky and such like, they're just going to put out largely the UK government's message, and that kind of gap and the nuance between the two, where there might be different circumstances or there might be different rules. We've seen that time and time again, where they haven't recognised that education is devolved, that health is devolved, that justice is devolved, and that there might be different approaches going on. So I think it does hamper getting that message out. And we do have, you know, a power in social media, and the number of people that follow, for example, Nicola Sturgeon, and getting those messages out is important. But there's lots of people that just won't reach. Yeah.
And just finally on this kind of part of our discussion today, Alison, what are the plans at Westminster over the next, over the foreseeable couple of weeks? Is there anything planned to discuss changing the lockdown regulations or anything?
Well, those regulations should come back before the House in due course, and we will have a discussion on Monday, debate on Monday on the response to coronavirus, where the likes of Philippa will be putting our case in that debate. But the real opportunities, I suppose, to discuss things properly and to put that scrutiny, we are kind of limited by the constraints of the virtual parliament that they've managed to create. And I must say, full credit to the staff at Westminster for having put together this virtual parliament, put together a system by which we can actually vote in that parliament, and doing that in very short notice. They've done a tremendous job, but it's still not quite as much time as we would get in the House to scrutinise things under normal circumstances, and it is a wee bit more difficult to hold people to account.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do have to move on a wee bit. The TUC this week published a document talking about what would need to be in place for them to feel safe for their workers to go back to work. And as we start to look at this, clearly, if we are going to lift the lockdown in any sense, we have to think about what's going to be in place for people going back to work. Alison, come to you first. Is the TUC right to be concerned about a lack of clarity so far on how lockdown and how social distancing and all these things can be managed in the workplace?
Yes, I think the TUC are absolutely correct to point this out. And Francis O'Grady said that we can't rely on the goodwill of bosses to look out for their employees. In the first few weeks of the lockdown and of this crisis, my office was inundated with people saying, that my boss is making me come in, I don't feel safe, we've not got the appropriate social distancing in the place that I work, I'm fearful of speaking out in case I get the sack. So unless you're going to put all of these regulations and guidance into law and give people that reassurance that they can say, my office doesn't feel safe, for example, to their boss, if they can't do that with any confidence that the law stands behind them, then it's just going to be an opportunity for those bosses, for those irresponsible bosses, to exploit people. I know there are lots of good bosses out there that will do their very, very best, but even in doing so, they feel as though perhaps the guidance isn't clear enough and they're not sure what to do for the best.
Yeah.
So I think making it clear for everybody is really important. And there's a difference in the way that the STUC has been working with the Scottish Government to raise concerns and to draw up those guidelines together. And they've been very clear that unless things feel safe, they're not going to allow people to go back to work. And I think working closely in collaboration with and cooperation with the trade unions is the best way forward in this.
Yeah. Ken, much the same question to you. What do you make of this concern from the TUC that there just isn't a structure in place to ensure that employers are doing the right thing?
Well, there's not much I can add. I mean, there has to be clear and consistent a message that what's going on there. I mean, going back to our Prime Minister, who boasted several weeks ago that he'd shaken hands with CV members in a hospital, just sends out the wrong kind of message. And certainly our own civil servant who travelled to their own property during lockdown obviously sends out the very, very wrong message that gets amplified. Well, if it's okay for these guys, it's okay for us. So there has to be definitive terms that state what you can and what you cannot do. I know it sounds draconian, but this is not just a very bad dose of the flu. This is an absolute disaster of a virus. And people need to understand that it's not the kind of thing, just because you go to the supermarket to pick up some essentials that, everybody seems to be normal. It is deadly. You really need to understand how bad this thing is. So as soon as we can get some clarity and some statements, the better certainly for Scotland. England is just, I don't know what they're doing. I honestly have no idea what they're trying to do other than trying to maintain this damage limitation exercise of saying, look, we're the good guys, we're doing our best.
Mm-hmm. And Alison, you mentioned that the STUC has taken a slightly different approach, that it's working with the Scottish Government, trying to create the right framework for however people are going to get back to work. Does the government, either the Scottish Government or the UK Government or both, have a responsibility to help businesses, for example, provide personal protective equipment and to maybe give financial support if businesses can't operate at full capacity during this period when we're still kind of under maybe partial lockdown?
Well, I think there's been lots of financial assistance given in lots of different ways to different companies. I think the guidance is the important thing here, and to make sure that people understand what is meant by a face covering rather than a face mask, so that we don't divert important resources away from the NHS and from care homes and that sector. So I think the guidance should help to make that clear, and if there are additional costs to businesses, then I think that is something that both governments should look at. And I know that some supermarkets, for example, have had to put in plastic screens and other things, and those things don't come for free. They have to be paid for somehow or another. So it may be useful to look at that kind of thing as we go ahead into the next phase of this.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, this week as well, we heard from Ivan McKee that he's managed to negotiate an agreement to have more PPE produced in Scotland. They reckon that now about half of all the gowns that are needed in Scottish hospitals can actually be produced in Scotland. I mean, I assume that's something you would welcome. Is that something we should be kind of pushing harder on, is getting Scottish industry working on the things that we need to manage the crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, I know Ivan from a long time. He and I worked in the same company that were heavily involved in supply chain solutions. And one of the things that he will be doing is a lean manufacturing process and making sure that the product is available for as many people as possible. And I just wish that we had done this. I mean, not fault of Ivan, but we'd done this on our own some months back to make sure that there wasn't a kind of lack of constant deliveries. So we have the ability in Scotland to make whatever's needed. This nonsense that you hear from down south about having Dyson, a vacuum cleaner, making class 3 medical devices is just fog that we need to understand that they just haven't got a clue. A JCB ventilator, this is nonsense stuff. We were never prepared as a United Kingdom. Scotland's faring far better than the rest of the other countries, and I'm just glad that Ivan's in charge of this, because I know the guy well, and he knows what he's doing too.
Mm-hmm. And Alison, again, this issue of PPE throughout this crisis has been an ongoing thorn in the side of especially the UK government. Scottish government has had problems too, but it seems to have been a bigger problem down south. Again, where do you think that can be improved right now, especially, as I say, with the potential that people are going to need PPE to go back to normal jobs, not just jobs in the health or care sectors?
Yeah, I think it's clear that for some years now in the UK as a whole, there hasn't been enough stockpiling and resourcing of PPE in the background. That seems to be pretty clear in terms of the test exercise that was carried out a few years ago, and that seems to be a symptom, I suppose, of how the NHS in England largely has been managed. And we've got slightly more advantageous, I think, set up in Scotland in the way that the NHS is managed and resourced and run. But it's not to say that there hasn't been an issue with this, because there clearly has. And I think particularly for the care sector, that's perhaps something that we need to look at a bit more carefully and a bit more closely, in terms of making sure that they get the appropriate equipment and quickly, to make sure that they can minimise the risk to people, and for carers who go into people's homes as well. I think that's really incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving on again, we heard this week from Priti Patel that there may be quarantine introduced at our airports around the UK. Throughout this crisis, there have been thousands of flights coming into the UK from all over the world, and there hasn't even been any sort of testing at immigration points. We know that that's something that a lot of people have called for. Joanna Cherry in particular has been calling for this for weeks. But we still don't even have any news on when these changes might actually happen. So Alison, coming to you first, why do you think it has taken Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, so long to make what seems like a really obvious decision to try and slow down the number of new cases that might be coming in from outside the country?
I mean, this, as far as Priti Patel is concerned, I've spoken on many occasions about how incompetent the Home Office are in so many different ways. So in some ways it doesn't surprise me that it's taken them this long to get organised, but in other ways it is really quite concerning. And because Westminster has been on lockdown for some while, it's been a while since I've actually got a plane back to Glasgow, so I can't tell what the circumstances are now. Certainly at the start of this, there was no public health advice anywhere. There was a very ageing poster about Ebola on the wall as you came through the door at Glasgow Airport, but nothing about coronavirus. And I think there really needs to be the time to have done this was several months ago. The time to do this is bolting the stable door after the horses a dot in the horizon. But I think it is important that we learn from what other countries have done and look at how you make sure that people are kept safe. And I've had lots of constituents who have been stuck in other countries around the world and come back to the UK eventually, because the FCO have also been not particularly helpful during this. And lots of those people that I'd spoken to had taken it upon themselves to isolate for 2 weeks after coming back. They hadn't had that official advice from anybody coming through the airport, but they'd said, no, I think it's my responsibility. I've been away in another country where there is coronavirus. I've been in a plane for several hours coming back from that country. I'm going to self-isolate for 14 days coming back. But they were asking me, how should I do that? What's the rules? What's the guidance on this? And the UK government should have had guidance there right from the very start, because there have been people in and out of airports across the UK, and there will continue to be so, even in this period. So I think the government guidance is way too late.
Yeah. And Ken, I mean, way back on, I think it was February the 6th, we spoke to a chap called Victor Rudenka, a musician who'd been touring China had gone back home to Belarus, had basically been told you need to go home, and he'd come through the airport in Warsaw and been ignored. But then when he got to Belarus, he was met at the airport and told you need to go home, stay isolated. Well, not even go home, go somewhere away from home. And isolate yourself for 2 weeks because we need to try and protect the population. Now, that was the beginning of February. As I say, I'm pretty sure that was February the 6th. It's an interesting interview if anybody wants to go back and have a look at it. But again, this question of why has it taken so long for this government in particular, which was so pro-Brexit, so being able to control our own borders, why do you think they've taken so long to think about quarantine at the airports?
Because they're Tories and they're crassly incompetent. It's as simple as that. There is no other explainable answer to why those people who were so argumentative about taking control of our own borders, they just ignore them. And people are dying because of these decisions. It's not as if somebody's car's been late getting delivered after an MOT. People are dying because of decisions by the folk down south that have voted these incompetents in. There's not many we can, put honey on it as best you can, but when people are dying in the numbers that they are, this is down to the Tories. This is really down to Boris Johnson, and I'm so angry about this. I'm surprised there are no riots in the streets. It's just people have to wake up and realise what's being done and start changing this for the better.
Uh-huh. You hide your anger so well, Ken. It's so hard to tell.
Well, no, I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but the fact of the matter is that people are dying. Families are losing friends and family for absolutely no reason other than dogma. And Priti Patel, God, I wouldn't even put her in charge of a cat and dog home, never mind anything else. It has to be said. You can't couch it in any other terms. These people are murdering citizens of the United Kingdom by their actions. Mm-hmm. Deliberately or otherwise, I have no idea, but these people need to go. They seriously need to get out of the way and let some people who care about the citizens of the United Kingdom take charge and take control.
And Alison, as Ken said, this is a government. They were elected in December on the mandate of getting Brexit done. The government is pretty much, in fact, the whole Tory party now is pretty much signed up to the hardest Brexit they can manage. This was a lot of it anyway, was predicated on the ability to take back control of their borders. Meanwhile, we've seen every country in the EU close its borders during this crisis, even within the Schengen zone. And yet the British government, now that we've actually left the EU and have the power to close the borders because of an emergency situation, they've not done it. What was the point of Brexit?
Well, exactly.
Kenny, I love you.
Yeah. What was the point of Brexit? It's a good question. And the UK has always had a degree of control over its borders and has chosen not to take it. I mean, for example, they never counted people leaving the country. So they didn't know who was here. They could have done that. They never did that. So there's all kinds of issues where this is just sheer incompetence, as Ken says. And I think as far as Brexit goes, if we had not had to be pursuing this course of Brexit against our will, we could have been collaborating and working closely with European countries to try and get to learn from the lessons that they've learned, to be part of the supply chains that they're able to access as a big trading bloc, to be part of the way in which countries are working together to defeat coronavirus. And I think it's really, really sad and entirely on form for this Tory government that they don't want to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. And
Kenny, can I just add in a point here? This Brexit, it's actually the 31st of December before the United Kingdom apparently cuts ties formally, and that's when we're going to have a worse situation. We seem to be determined to roller coaster way through a clean-cut Brexit at the end of this year. Currently, we have unlimited vehicles that can enter the country because of our European status. After the 31st of December, they'll be limited by carnets. These are documents that are given to vehicles that can legally be allowed to come from Europe into the United Kingdom. So I have no idea what the food situation is going to be then. So, I mean, this is a disaster heaped upon disaster.
Yeah, and of course that to extend that beyond December, there needs to be a decision taken by the end of June, isn't it, Alison? That's right.
They're saying that they don't want to change. They say they're continuing to break free on the 31st of December.
Mm-hmm.
But the media are suspiciously quiet about this fact that there will be problems with food going forward on the 1st of January.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into the Brexit conversation, but when we talk about this closing borders, and we've talked about the difference between Scotland and England. Alison, in the case of a public health emergency, does the Scottish Government have the power to potentially close the border with England if it believes that England is moving too fast in lifting lockdown measures?
I'm not sure where exactly that would stand, but we have seen Police Scotland turning people back who've been going to Scotland for unnecessary journeys. So we had a case of some people who were away to have their 3 days holiday in Motherwell. We had a case of some people who were going up to Dundee to buy a puppy. Those people were stopped on the road and turned back. And that's not closing the border. That's saying don't come across if you're making an unnecessary journey. And that's enforcing the situation that we have in Scotland. So I think that's perhaps where Police Scotland might go with that. And it's not to say that, articulated lorries bringing food over the border would be turned back, because that would be ridiculous.
Sure.
But it's making sure that people aren't coming up, with their caravan to spend a week in the Highlands. It's making sure that our own lockdown restrictions are held to.
Mm-hmm. And do you know if that's something that the Scottish Government is considering kind of turning up a wee bit, or Police Scotland, or whoever makes those decisions?
No, I wouldn't have an answer on that, but it certainly seems to be the approach that the police are taking so far, that if they think you're not travelling for good reason, they will stop you and turn you back. Yeah.
And Ken, just one last wee question on this. Do you think the Scottish Government has done the right thing so far in that kind of that frame of managing entries into Scotland? I mean, it would potentially have been possible to set up checkpoints at the Scottish airports, for example, but that hasn't been done. Do you think the Scottish Government could be going a little bit further?
Well, I don't know what legislation would allow them to do that, whether it's devolved or otherwise. But certainly, the fact is, just because you can see a lorry coming towards you doesn't need to say you have to wait for permission before you jump out of the way. We should be using every conceivable power that we have to protect our own folk. And common sense has just been blown to the wind here against political dogma. But having said that, out of the four countries within the Union, Scotland is definitely way ahead of common sense being used here in adult discussion, rather than this political quagmire that's emanated from down south.
Yeah, I mean, do you think the Scottish Government is what level of sympathy do you think there would be with the Scottish Government if it tried to do something like that? I mean, we've seen the media already kind of blow up every time Nicola Sturgeon has suggested doing anything that wasn't in lockstep.
Well, that's part of the benefit of being in the Union, is that you can't show up your other members. You can't show up London. That's a fact. You're not going to have that ability to do so. I mean, I recall when Alex Salmond was talking about riots that were happening in London, they were UK riots, but when he pointed out, well, actually, we're okay here, he get pilloried for that. So one thing is, you just have to face up to the fact that we have citizens in Scotland that we have to take care of. It is a job of any government to look after their citizens, not to say if some other country is going to decide whether they put in process powers that either let some of our citizens die or others not. But certainly shut the airports, shut the border, and work on controlling this deadly virus. As I said, people are dying, and that's the paramount. You can't let any more people die through this. Yeah. So do what you have to do.
Yeah, now we've talked a lot, obviously, about the differences between the response down south and the response here. But we've got some new opinion polling showing that people across the UK now have much less support for the UK government than they did even just a couple of weeks ago. They're now saying that they believe Italy had done better. 30% said Italy had done better versus 22% saying it had done worse. When they were asked last week, 29% said the UK had been worse and 25% said better. We've seen same turnaround on the figures relating to people thinking Spain had done better than the UK. People now think Spain have done better than the UK more than they think the UK has done better than Spain. And people also saying South Korea, Japan, Australia all doing better jobs than the UK. We've also seen very significant numbers of people saying that they trust Nicola Sturgeon, they trust what the Scottish Government is doing, and less people in Scotland supporting what's happening down south. Ken, I guess, first of all, what do you make of this turn in the polls to people saying that they think that the UK government has not done as well anymore as Spain and Italy?
Because their lies are being broadcast. Boris Johnson, as I said, on his first live broadcast to the nation was that the United Kingdom was leading the world in the fight against coronavirus. And this was an obvious lie. The fact that our own mainstream media, talking about UK mainstream media, never picked him up on it, and he gets very, very soft questions, shows that you can't trust them to hold the government to account. Nicola Sturgeon, on the other hand, regardless of my thoughts on the SNP government today, she walks the walk and she talks the talk. She actually delivers what she says she's going to do, and she talks common sense. On the other hand, there's no flim-flam, there's no idea to do a party political broadcast as she's chatting. She tells people how it is. Boris just doesn't come across well as a leader that you want to jump over that parapet with. And people are now beginning to see this. A lot of people, by the way, generally don't get involved in politics. They don't go through the news. They just read what they read in the general mainstream papers, headlines, and they form an opinion from that. But slowly but surely, that kind of barrier is being broken down, and they're now realising that they know somebody who's passed away, they know somebody who's ill. It's beginning to affect them, and when it affects them, opinions change. And for Boris, it's not a good way.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, not everybody is obsessed with politics. There's only 51% or so of people expressed an opinion on that question about the UK versus Italy and Spain. But it's still a majority of those who have an opinion now think the UK is doing a bad job compared to these countries that a few weeks ago we were talking about as disaster areas. Alison, what do you make of this turn in the polling? Do you think it's going to have any effect?
I think last time I was on the show, on one of the ones during the week, we were talking about polling and saying that people were generally supportive of the efforts of a government in a crisis. And I think what has perhaps changed from there is people seeing the efforts of the government not being effective. People seeing the efforts of the UK government as being putting people at risk, being unclear, the messaging stuff that we were talking about today, that the government doesn't know what it's doing, that it is incompetent. People are beginning to see that more and more, either because, as Ken says, they know people who've been affected by the virus directly now, or because they're perhaps sticking and doing their bit, and they're seeing lots of other people not doing their bit and nothing happening about it. So people are starting to get that kind of unease and say, well, what's happening here? What's the direction? What's happening? And they're not really seeing that leadership from the UK government. Whereas in Scotland, Nicola has been out every day doing what she can, being very, very clear about what she's saying and what she's doing, even to the point of when she doesn't have an answer, she will say that rather than try and make something up. But I think that's a real point of clarity from a politician, to admit if you don't know something, just say you don't know something, but you'll find out. And I think that's important, to have that kind of honesty from people, and it's refreshing, particularly when you see UK government press conferences.
Yeah.
When you hear Boris Johnson actually giving the illusion that somehow this bank holiday weekend was going to be a major relaxation when the stats for deaths are going up, and then you have his own PR team openly denying that that's what the message should have been, you suddenly realise that you just can't trust or believe anything that comes out from these guys. There's no consistency of message. They're not on message. It just seems to be reactionary to whatever headline you get that day, or whether you feel as if your feet are getting burnt by being held to the fire by many, many individuals. But certainly one thing is for sure is that whilst we talk, and whilst he pontificates about having his 7 p.m. stuff, people are dying because of actions that they've directly taken to deny access to the PPE that they need, and to send out a very, very poor message to what people should be doing and shouldn't be doing. And it's just going to get worse. I don't see them having anybody there in charge that can make things better. I think they're just trying to ride it out and hope that they'll get through Brexit without any problems.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, there's a few specific questions in this poll as well about specific things that people restrictions that might be lifted. And it's pretty remarkable. Fewer than 1 in 10 people think that schools, offices, and non-essential shops should reopen yet. And then people saying that even if restrictions are lifted, 3 in 5 people said they still wouldn't feel comfortable eating in a restaurant. Over half said they wouldn't feel comfortable using the underground or travelling by bus or train. And even going back to work in offices, over a third of people said they'd be uncomfortable going back to work in an office. What do you think then is the motivation behind changing the message on lockdown, given that clearly people in general are not ready for lockdown to be lifted?
There are a lot of people, I can assure you, who are stuck in 20-storey flats that are climbing the walls. I mean, their mental health worries me greatly that there has to be some kind of light at the end of the tunnel of what they can and can't do. And certainly from the Scottish Government, I think they're trying to be clear and realistic about the dangers of this virus and why everybody knows that they need to go out there and try and get some kind of normality back into their lives, that they need to be patient, as difficult as it can be. But there's no easy answer. You can't. People just don't like to be told the truth, is that you can go out there's a hidden killer you can catch. It's better that we get the numbers down where we can manage them, control them and trace them, rather than just, this shotgun scatter approach that the UK government's trying to push. You need to stay in. You need to keep away from crowds and people. And if you do have to go out, you have to keep a real distance. I've gone to a supermarket for a big shop, and I've done the 6 feet apart in a huge queue to get into the supermarket. And then you get guys just walk up and lean over you to grab something because they don't have the patience to wait until I move away. Now, this is just people being selfish. And until we can get rid of the selfishness and realise this won't happen unless we all follow the general health and safety rules regarding isolation. And the sooner you do that, the numbers they say, will come down, and it makes it a lot easier to track and trace and contain this virus. So we're going to have to be patient, but you need to understand this virus is deadly. Deadly. It's not flu. It's not a bad flu. It's death. Please understand that.
Yeah. And Alison, we on Broadcasting Scotland, we also had an exclusive poll giving voting intentions for Westminster and for Holyrood. This showed an incredible, frankly, lead for the SNP in both. Over 50% of those who had an opinion said they would be voting SNP in both Holyrood and Westminster. What do you think that particular number says about the way people are looking at the UK just now?
It certainly shows me that people are looking at what the Scottish Government are doing. They are seeing, in large part, that the actions are sound, that there's competence there, that things are being done for the right reasons as well. And it also highlights to me, in terms of the other parties, that the other parties really have nothing much by way of leadership to show here. And the Labour Party have not found what they want to say on any issue, and the Tories in Scotland particularly are just echoing madly what Boris Johnson's coming out with. And I think that's not going to win them any favours, I don't think. But it does show a real clear difference in the approaches and endorsements of those approaches in the rest of the UK and in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. And obviously the First Minister has been at pains to avoid any sort of political sniping during this crisis, albeit she's found it difficult, I think, to not be too aggressive with her language about Boris Johnson in the last few days. But we have an election due next May. It's less than a year away now. And if we're still kind of dealing with this crisis, how difficult is it going to be to fight an election when you might be worried about social distancing, so canvassing might be difficult. The politics of, attacking other parties during an election campaign might be quite challenging. Even potentially holding debates and hustings and things could be very difficult if we're still not able to gather in large numbers. Do you have any thoughts on how an election might work if we're still under some sort of restrictions at that point?
I think an election in those circumstances would be incredibly difficult, because a lot of what happens in elections is that human contact. It's chatting to people one-to-one, it's chatting to people in groups, it's chatting to folk on street corners and other things. And if there is no sense that people are going to be out and about in street corners, then you're not going to be able to chat to them anyway. So I think there's a place, should that be the case, for digital campaigning. I've seen the sort of idea of people having Zoom branch meetings, so they could have perhaps Zoom public meetings and things like that. I'm not quite sure the practicalities of that and making sure that all voices are heard, but that's certainly something that could be looked at. Mm-hmm. But it would be a very different election than what we're used to. And the campaigning element of that is one thing. The policy and the criticising other parties and the kind of the heat of debate is quite another as well. And I think that would make for a very different election. I can only hope that we're further out of this now by the time next year comes round. But I think it's one to watch, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, what do you make of the politics here? I mean, we've seen one of our tweeters there mentioning the idea that this could be a kind of fulcrum point for independence, that divergence here. If more lives can be saved in Scotland, it could show how different an independent Scotland could be. What's your feeling about the politics of this and how it's going to play out over the next year or so?
My own personal opinion is there's going to be a paradigm shift in how we do everything going forward because of this coronavirus situation. I have my doubts whether May will actually see an election. I know that they have to, but I think that legislation will be brought in to defer it, depending how quickly or how slowly we're able to address this contamination. But everything's going to change, certainly. I doubt very much indeed whether there will be the large venues discussions, probably till September, October. Even then, it may well be distanced apart. But one thing, certainly for the SNP, I think they should be cautious about is that since 2014 to 2015, they've had to contend with a groundswell of people who are wondering what's happened since 2014. Where are we going with this? And I know that we've been fighting Brexit, when the SNP's been fighting Brexit and they've been fighting coronavirus. But independence, in my view, would have seen that our borders would have been closed and our airports would have been shut and our ports would have been shut. And our ability to do as Ivan McKee's doing now would have been done a long, long time ago. And we would have tackled this differently. On one size, UK doesn't fit all. And I think that questions are going to be asked if we do go ahead in May. And I think there's going to have to be some really good arguments to ask why we deferred the process of independence any longer.
Yeah. Well, we do move on now to our last topic of the day. And this week, of course, saw the 75th anniversary of VE Day. And then, of course, yesterday was Europe Day. Now, those two things are linked. The creation of the European Union, the coal and steel community, as it was at first, was a way to intertwine the economies of Germany and France to the extent that they couldn't go to war again. And we do have a wee video clip of Philippa Whitford speaking in Parliament. This was a wee while ago, but I think it speaks very highly of Philippa. She talks about her husband Hans, who of course is German, and his experience. So we'll just show that clip and then we'll talk a wee bit more about it.
And giving way. Most people in this chamber know that my husband is German. What not all of them will know is that his mother was Polish and his parents were not allowed to marry. The child they had together was taken from them. His mother was a forced labourer and his father was lifted by the Gestapo. And long before we ended up in this mess, he used to celebrate that in one generation he could live and work where he wanted and marry who he loved. And in one more generation, we're taking it away. It's shameful.
Now, we had a discussion about VE Day on Friday with Murray Pittock and with Ellen Hofer. We talked quite a bit about the kind of mentality about VE Day. Now, we saw on Friday there people apparently completely ignoring lockdown rules to go and have street parties. We saw people dancing the conga, a socially distanced conga. Alison, coming to you first, what did you make of the way that we celebrated VE Day rather than commemorated it?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it should be a commemoration, not a celebration. And I was very struck by some of the tweets of people saying, well, the war was still going on, there was still people losing their lives, there was still a lot of heartbreak in VE Day, and it's not necessarily something to celebrate. And I was reflecting on my own family's experience. Lots of people were posting up pictures of their grandfathers and so on, and it was actually only my gran that served in the Second World War. She was in the Wrens. And she'd said something like when VA Day was announced, they had a wee sherry, and that was it, really. There was not the kind of great sense of celebration that people were seeming to apportion to it now. And when you look at Europe Day in contrast to that and what has been achieved through winning the peace, it's not about winning the war, it's about winning the peace and bringing those countries together in such a way that that war is unimaginable. That's really the legacy that you want to look at it from that. You don't want to look at bunting and street parties. You want to look at international cooperation and friendship, because that's what came from that, and that's the thing that we really should value from that wartime experience.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, one of the things that Murray Pittock was saying was that one of the reasons that we're so obsessed with World War II kind of rhetoric and that whole period of our history is because that was the last time Britain was a world power. And it's one reason that he sees that rhetoric being dragged out over and over again, particularly when it comes to Brexit. We heard during the campaign, we heard the EU referred to as the Fourth Reich. What do you make of the way that the UK and I suppose Scotland and England, if you think there's a major difference, has kind of grappled with that history?
Oh, God, where to begin?
You've only got 5 minutes, so
Okay, so London, or the London establishment, are a warlike nation. They define themselves by victories. You just have to look at the statues and the battles and all these monuments by power, by being the best, by ruling the waves, or even the Beatles saying, I read the news today, oh boy, the English army had just won the war. This is beaten into us that we are unique. Never, never shall we be slaves. And this rhetoric just seeps into the psyche of UK citizens. But having said that, Scottish citizens are worse than that because they are not true Brits in a true sense. As are the Irish or the Welsh for that matter. So this nationalism, this English nationalism, which is now coming to the fore and is seen in the kind of far right attitudes, is what started Brexit. We've gone through World War II, we can do anything, we can leave Europe without any problems, we'll stand alone, we're unique, who the hell, who's better than us? And it's just nonsense. It's a complete and utter fallacy that the UK, even during World War II, were the leading power, standing alone. They weren't standing alone. There was other countries involved, but just like anything else, they get the light's not allowed to shine on them. It has to be the establishment down south. So Dunkirk was look at Dunkirk, portrayed as a wonderful exercise of how good we are. These were defeats, badly managed defeats. The British Army seemed to think that they were the guys that had actually won it in Europe, when in actual fact the Russians had more to contribute as the Americans and other countries involved. So this English nationalist idea is something that people need to learn was never the case. And the sooner we get this notion of being a warlike nation as something to celebrate or commemorate, is just something to be totally ashamed of in actual fact.
Mm-hmm. And Alison, as we look forward, is there anything that you would like to Anything that you would like to change about just how we view the war, how we view ourselves in Europe? I mean, I'm sure I can guess some of what you're going to say, but in terms of how we kind of relate ourselves to the war and look forward rather than back, what would you like to see from the UK?
I think just reflecting on it with a bit more realism rather than through those rose-tinted spectacles. And in the bookcase behind me, there's an excellent book by O'Toole called Heroic Failure, and I would absolutely recommend folk to read that because it gives a sort of a sense of that kind of little Englishness and where the truth stands, and it's well worth reading. But looking at things with realism, I think, is more important than looking at things as if it was harking back to some kind of glorious era, because it was really hard for folk during the Second World War. And there was rationing, people lost their lives, towns like Clydebank were completely destroyed. There was a huge amount of hardship that came from that, and it took generations to rebuild parts of our cities as a result. So people should reflect carefully on that and what war actually meant to lots of people, rather than sort of imagining it as some glorious era that it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. We're now at the stage whereby the coronavirus deaths have exceeded the total victims of the Blitz in World War II. Just think on that. These are people, families' lives destroyed by political dogma. Mm-hmm. And what has the government done? They've brought in this narrative of we're fighting a war and bringing up all the jingoistic stuff, which is partly to blame for the idea of Brexit, is that we are unique. We can go through anything. We can have powdered egg. We are the greatest. This has to stop.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a fairly somber note to end on, but hopefully, if somebody down in Westminster is listening, then hopefully it can be a positive for them to take forward. But that is, as I say, pretty much all we've got time for today. So thank you so much to Ken McDonald and to Alison Thewliss for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have both of you, or either of you, on the show. And I hope you'll be back soon. But we'd like to thank you at home for joining us as well. You're the most important part of this equation. If there wasn't an audience, there would be no point in us being here at all. So if you're able to support us, we would be very, very grateful. You can do that by going to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. If you sign up as a supporter there, your £5 a month can make a huge difference to what we're able to do here at Broadcasting Scotland. Right now, we're running on a shoestring budget, and there's only so much we can do about anything. We want to do more and more. We want to become the kind of independent broadcaster that Scotland deserves, and you can help us make that happen. If you're not able to support us financially, then we do understand it's not an easy time for anybody, and that's fine. The shows will always be free for you to view online. But you can still help us. Follow us at Broadcast Scot on Twitter, or search Broadcasting Scotland on Facebook. Follow us there, and then you can share the shows around. It's always good. I mean, the number of tweeters we had joining us during the show today is great. Just keep talking about the shows. Let people know what Broadcasting Scotland is, where we are, what we do, and why you think we're worth supporting. That's the only way we can build our audience, because we don't have any budget for advertising just now. So if you're able to do that, then that's a huge help to us as well. We really want to build this audience so that we can be a different kind of conduit for the news in Scotland. As we said earlier, this is a problem that places like Wales have a serious problem with independent media. Here we are blessed with iScot and Broadcasting Scotland and various others, Indie Live and whatnot. But you need to support them if they're going to survive. So please do. And finally, if you want to get involved here, again, there's always work to be done. So if you're willing to roll your sleeves up and do a wee bit of work for us, then that's brilliant. Whether that's as a journalist to prepare stories, prepare the shows, whether it's working behind the camera or getting in front of the camera. I mean, I had only ever been in front of the camera once or twice before I came here, and then I got thrust into it, and I'm really quite enjoying it now. So if you want to get involved that way too, there's always room for more people to get involved, even if there isn't necessarily room for us all to be socially distanced properly in the studio right now. There's work you can always do from home. But again, I'd just like to thank Alison and Ken for joining us. As I say, it's always a pleasure to speak to both of them. Thank you for joining us as well. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I'll be back on Tuesday as normal. But until then, have a lovely Sunday.